The Security Industry Association. I want to welcome everybody to our SIA Economic Outlook briefing this afternoon. And in just a moment, I'm going to introduce our very special guest. So as many of you know, the Economic Outlook briefing series was established as a means for us to provide timely analysis into current economic conditions, both on a federal level and today on a state level to our members and throughout the industry. The Economic Outlook series today, this particular program, builds on the success of our recent programs that have included the chief economist for NASDAQ, Phil McIntosh, and the chief economist for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Curtis DeBay. Now, today it is really an honor for me to introduce Mr. Jonathan Williams. Jonathan is the chief economist and the executive vice president of policy at the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC. Let me just take a moment to talk about ALEC, and I know Jonathan will as well. ALEC is an extremely respected, nonpartisan forum or body for state legislators. And my understanding is that approximately 60 million Americans are represented by ALEC members who actively participate in developing and debating key policy issues, including criminal justice, homeland security, and economic policy issues, and tax, and many other topics. Our colleague, Colby Williams, who does a terrific job for us in government relations, is the chair of the Private Sector Homeland Security Task Force. And Colby, through his leadership and with the support of Jonathan, the entire ALEC team, we recently had 2 resolutions adopted by the task force in ALEC pertaining to school security and utility security, which are huge topics for our members and key markets. But more about Jonathan. Jonathan's analysis and his voice into economic issues has been received by an incredible audience of media publications as well as broadcast outlets that have included the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, the Financial Times, Toronto Star, and Investors Business Daily, Fox Business News, and Bloomberg News. He is a contributor for The Hill, which has a substantial subscriber base, and is a columnist at Tax Analyst. And now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming Jonathan, and we look forward to his presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Don, for that kind introduction. And we really appreciate the involvement of you and Colby and the entire association team within ALEC and our Homeland Security Task Force specifically. As you referenced, I mean, that's been an incredible opportunity to raise issues of key interest to your members within ALEC and with our broad and diverse ALEC membership. So we really appreciate that partnership and look forward to many years ahead of partnering with you and your members. And I really appreciate the opportunity to just talk a little bit today about the landscape in the economic policy space that we're seeing, both a little bit nationally and at the federal level from a policy environment perspective. But of course, what ALEC focuses most on is what's happening in the 50 states, our 50 laboratories of democracy. The idea, of course, that our founders had that most key decisions shouldn't be made in Washington, D.C. and a far off federal capital, but closest to the people and most responsible to the people into their needs. And so we're going to talk through, what's going on at the state level from an economic environment perspective and some of the policy drivers for where we're at right now, both at a state and federal level. But as Don alluded to, I just wanted to spend one moment to introduce many of you potentially for the first time to ALEC. And we just actually celebrated our 50-year anniversary this year, or as an organization, several weeks ago. We were founded back in 1973 by a small group of state legislators, actually outside of Chicago, Illinois, that said we need a voice for state legislators to pursue principled free market ideas and to bring together. I think that's one of the great things about ALEC is bring together folks from the public sector, from the state legislative bodies, as well as our friends like yours, Don, at the Association of the Private Sector, to come up with best practices and really proven, trusted policy solutions for the states. And now we represent nearly 2,000 state legislators across the United States and hundreds of companies and associations and nonprofits who believe in this idea of sharing ideas and coming up with best practices within the idea of pro-business policy and limited government policies. And so ALEC is just an incredible, unique place. I've had the opportunity to serve on staff now for more than 16 years, traveled to 50 states multiple times over. In fact, just in the last year alone, I think I've been in 35 states working with our state lawmakers and really providing resources from our perspective of what works and what doesn't work. That's what it's all about in terms of determining the key policy drivers that will bring not only our states, but of course, eventually at the federal level and our national level, economic success. So what I wanted to focus on today is just a few key points, and I'll be somewhat brief on the front end of this and spend a little bit more time what we spend time at ALEC working on at the state economic level, but a few macroeconomic trends I think to just chat through briefly. I mean, obviously we've been through a very difficult, volatile period coming out of the COVID lockdown and pandemic, and the economic downturn from that is then, of course, the run up in equities and some of the market recovery as things became a little bit better known and open for business. But I will say, I mean, the multi-trillion-dollar question right now, of course, is Jerome Powell and others are asking, is can we bring this economy in for the quote-unquote soft landing? And of course, that is, I think, still an open-ended question. I think there's some encouraging signs as we begin to see at least the overall inflation numbers begin to ease. We've begun to see, we've certainly seen a somewhat of an unexpected economic recovery when it comes to equities over the last several months. And then we've seen surprisingly resilient GDP growth. And those are all, good signs that should be celebrated. Now, underneath the surface of all of those things, there are some still very concerning signs, as well as some others that I want to just briefly mention. For instance, any of you that are in real estate or have been in at least personally looking for a house lately, checking the 30-year mortgage rates right now for a 30-year fixed mortgage presents, I think, one of our largest challenges for economic long-term recovery going forward, and that is somewhat of the weakness in the housing space, whether that is commercial, certainly, where we have the new dynamics of companies not going back to a 5-day work week, potentially ever in the careers of many. And then we have the dynamic of residential with new home starts as well as home sales being very weak in the most recent numbers reported back in October that I saw. And so you combine that with just the enhanced cost of the borrowing for average homeowners, and you have a situation with real housing drag, I think, on economic growth going forward. Also unpacking a little bit more under the surface of GDP and inflation numbers. Let's not forget, while the numbers are good on the top line GDP in the last reporting period, but let's not forget that a big driver of GDP is government spending. And so we've seen unprecedented run up in federal spending, in 2020 and in years going forward now, whether it was the initial COVID relief efforts or additional efforts with inflation reduction in mind. We can obviously have a robust debate around whether that's been successful or not. But I think that that's always something to keep in mind when you look at GDP numbers, is government spending is baked in those numbers. And when you subtract out the government spending piece of GDP, we're looking at a much different, more sobering picture for GDP going forward. Then obviously the key of inflation is whether you're looking at just the core inflation, which obviously separates out energy and food prices. When you ask the average American, what they're most bothered about, it's energy and food prices. And so when they see CPI numbers and reported on the core numbers going down precipitously, which is good, they still wonder, why are the costs of regular goods not going down? And so I think there's a bit of a dichotomy from some of the reported numbers when we see either on GDP or inflation and what some of the actual realities are underneath those numbers. And the other piece that I think from a macro perspective, and this kind of bleeds in as a good segue to our federal economic policy trends piece of the discussion, and that is our national debt, right? I mean, we look at, if you go to the National Debt Clock website, it's kind of a terrifying pace that we see the debt to continuing to increase, where we're rapidly approaching $34 trillion in national debt. And of course, the new dynamic with interest rates where they've been, especially in the last year, is financing the debt costs with a 33+ trillion national debt at a much higher interest rate, of course, than the federal government was used to paying as debt ran up over the last decade. And I should say, I mean, this has been a bipartisan problem. Republicans and Democrat administrations, members of Congress from both parties, I think we can all agree there's been an issue with the rate of growth of spending relative to the rate of growth of the economy. And that's been a big driver to this issue of $34 trillion of national debt. To the extent now, when you look at the numbers of the debt cost, the cost to service the debt and pay the interest on the debt, we're talking about, last I checked, I think it was the third largest line item in the federal budget after Social Security and Department of Health and Human Services. That's a shocking run up in just a very short amount of time, even after coming out of some of the needed aid packages during the pandemic. So I think when you talk to economists, one of the larger threats, I think, is this overall weakness and potential for a sovereign debt issue that, we're certainly not in the situation of Greece or some of the South American economies that had that, existential issue of potential default around the debt. But it does weigh heavily, I think, on certainly when you talk about the dollar as a world reserve currency and the strength of the United States economy writ large, as we have certainly competitor nations, adversary nations around the world looking thinking about every day how to dethrone the United States dollar and get around our system of sanctions. That's something I think weighs heavily on many economists' mind, as well as policymakers in Washington, D.C. To transition a little bit into that discussion at the federal level, and I'm not going to dwell here because I'm a bit of a glass half full guy. I'm occasionally known as the happy economist. And so I don't spend a lot of time thinking about some of the real challenges in Washington, D.C., and I like to focus on many of the successes that we're seeing at other levels of government. But I think it's important to at least touch on it. And that is, going into the environment right now in Washington, certainly a new Speaker of the House, someone who's come in, I think, with an agenda on looking at a bipartisan debt commission. I think it's been a very positive discussion in the opening weeks of Speaker Johnson's administration in the House. But that being said, I think there's a real gridlock, at least for the next year ahead, and likely far beyond that, even if there were a realignment politically. This isn't a political discussion whatsoever. Obviously, with the U.S. Senate and the 60 vote threshold, I think the name of the game for Washington going forward, as it has been in years past, is going to be a continuation of gridlock in much of the economic policy. And one of the things at the federal level that is especially concerning as it relates to this threat of gridlock is I think there's a real threat that we see in early 2024, as many of you followed the debate as it played out with the short-term spending deal that Speaker Johnson was able to negotiate that gets us through the end of calendar 2023. But as we get into early 2024, I think there's a legitimate chance of a government shutdown discussion or a threat around that. So, I mean, it's certainly been the potential in the past that can certainly spook markets going forward. Now, there, I think, needs to be a real rational discussion around this issue of debt and spending in Washington. So I don't take anything away from some of that needed discussion that may happen, but I do think in the first quarter of 2024, that's going to be a legitimate policy item in Washington. The other thing that I don't think has gotten nearly enough attention, certainly not as enough as it deserves, is the coming expiration of much of the tax package of 2017, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, signed into law by President Trump, championed by Speaker Ryan and others. Much of the business side of this is permanent, but much of the individual side is not. And by the end of the year 2025, 23, all of the individual provisions, 23 provisions on the individual side of the federal income tax go away if the federal government doesn't extend them, of course, due to Senate rules and the phase out of tax cuts that generally accompanies those packages. And as I just talked about the gridlock environment, many of you are familiar with it with your government affairs folks in Washington, D.C. That is something that is a real threat that the parties can't get together to renew some of those key elements of the tax reductions, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. We're already beginning to see the phase out of some of the business provisions, such as bonus expensing and depreciation rules. And then we get into some of the more key items for individuals, such as enhanced standard deduction, lower rates, and even things like the state and local tax deduction, the SALT deduction. So lots of uncertainty from a policy perspective in Washington. The one certainty I think there will be a real discussion around the federal debt and spending. And of course, that has implications for equity decisions going forward in the first quarter. To transition now a bit to the state economic policy trends, which is where I spend most of my time thinking as chief economist and head of policy at ALEC. So one of the publications that I put together annually is Rich States, Poor States. and we look at the economic outlook of all the states. And I've been putting this together for the last 16 years in conjunction with Arthur Laffer, an economist, of course, was best known for his work in the Reagan administration, but has advised presidents and governors of both parties over the last 50 years and just been a luminary in terms of thinking through state policy and federal policy issues. And Steve Moore, the former Wall Street Journal editorial board member and economist. And, this is something that we put together, and I'll walk through how we get to these rankings, and we'll go through at least the top and the bottom list of states, and happy to get into more of the details if you'd like in the questions. But essentially why we wanted to put this together is to give our ALEC legislators across the country, the 7,000 plus men and women of both parties that serve and try to make their states a better place to do business from a economic competitiveness standpoint, but also concerned citizens and business leaders all across the country that really want a barometer to say, how does my state stack up versus the other 49? I mentioned, I think one of the healthiest things about our system of government, and somewhat unique in the American experiment, is this idea that the founders empowered subnational governments, state and local governments, to carry the vast majority of the policy making. At least that was, of course, the theory. And I think we'd be wise as a nation to get back to more of that decentralized control. But as individual states have this ability to shape their own economic future, we see states going in various directions. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the common traits of the states that are doing well, I think, when it comes to all objective economic measures, and the states that are struggling from objective economic measures. And of course, this was somewhat highlighted if some of you caught the recent debate between Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and California Governor Gavin Newsom, talking about two of the largest states in America and how their different philosophies of government have really played out. And I think that was a robust debate. And I think that's a kind of debate that needs to happen more in Washington, D.C., and that we need to pay more attention to, is the differences between the states and what works and what doesn't. So I'd like to just, as you can see on the map here, there's a little bit of a regional factor in some cases. We see some regions, like the Mountain West is what I think one of the most competitive regions in America. We see the Northeast, I think, is struggled in some sense to keep business competitiveness is a key measure. And certainly states like California have struggled in recent years as well. So to the top 10, what we see here in Utah is just an incredible track record. And before I go through, I think, some of the success stories here in the top 10, I should mention the way that we get to this economic outlook score is we measure the states on 15 equally weighted factors, and we chose those 15 for a couple of different reasons. And I think that you could choose probably 100 and have very justified reasons for all of them. But we focused on, I think, the 15 that Dr. Laffer has studied now for 50 plus years as mattering the most for economic growth in one state versus another. But also, just as importantly, as we see many different organizations and ways that states can be measured against each other, we focus on categories and really the policy levers that state legislators can control in a given year. Obviously, it benefits states greatly in many cases, as a Michigan native, to have warm weather in the winters, and warm beaches are a great draw. There's why we have the snowbird phenomenon of folks from the north, of course, going down to the south during the winter months. It certainly helps a state to have deep water ports, or to have tourism, or have many of the natural factors that just benefit some states over another. And of course, state legislators would love to change that fact, the matter of having better geography or having better weather, but of course they can't legislate that in a state capital. And so we focus on the factors like taxes and regulation, labor policies, things that matter for growth, but also things that state legislators in a given year can make a great degree of difference in changing that trajectory of their state. So without further ado, to spend a few minutes on just unpacking the top 10, Utah has been an incredible success story. And I know you probably got many members there in Utah that have taken advantage of that predictable business climate, a state that just values, I think, that collaboration with public and private sector, but a state that has a lot of things going for it. It's been a state at number one for all 16 years running in rich states, poor states. And it's been one that has been a state that's been a real innovator, I think, on policy development that has then swept the country in subsequent years. And I'll give you a couple examples of why I think that's been the case. One is Going back 15 plus years now, Utah is a state that created a flat personal income tax, something that is was a trend in recent years that we've seen states try to enhance. Of course, if the most majority of small businesses pay on the individual side of the income tax, and so the personal income tax, in addition to any business related levies, is an important driver of economic competitiveness. Also, a thing that Utah has done has been address the property tax issue. Of course, business owners and businesses are some of the largest property taxpayers in America, but individuals, it's a huge drag on individual budgets, and it's been one that through assessment increases in recent years with the run-up in real estate values across the country has been a real drag on both businesses and individuals in terms of enhanced tax burdens, and Utah has really gotten ahead of that. And another thing that we probably don't have time to unpack from a policy perspective today, but analogous to the same issues at the federal level with the probably 100 trillion plus in unfunded liabilities in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, in addition to that 34 trillion of national debt that we were talking about a minute ago, the parallel track for the state level is unfunded public pension liabilities. If anybody's followed the news in Illinois or states that have been plagued with some of the largest biggest problems in unfunded liabilities, it's a huge cost driver for states, and it's really tax increases waiting to happen in the future. Utah's really been ahead of that curve as well and transitioned new public employees over to the 401k style retirement plans that probably most of your employees participate in, and you have a generous matching program, I'm sure. So North Carolina, Arizona, Idaho, Oklahoma round out our top 5 for economic outlook. There've been some really great economic success stories in those states that we're happy to get to in questions. Wyoming, Indiana, North Dakota, Florida, and Nevada round out the top 10 in rich states, poor states. And not to dwell a ton on this, but here are the states that have the worst economic outlook rankings in rich states, poor states in 2023. New York, 50th out of 50. A state that really, I think, some major threats, as we've seen during the pandemic, as more financial firms, more venture capital moved even outside of financial centers in Manhattan and towards places like South Florida, a huge area of growth for the financial sector. And so it's something that has kept New York's economy in the game. And if certainly if they were to continue to lose ground in that sector, it would be lights out for the state of New York. But 50th out of 50, Vermont, Minnesota, New Jersey, and Illinois round out the bottom 5. To go ahead a little bit to talk about the policy environment, one of the interesting things that we've tracked over the last several years now, just from a broad perspective of where states are, we've seen really historic high levels of state level surpluses. Now, this is due to a couple of different things. As the reopening of economies coming out of the pandemic, we saw the natural revenue growth really enhance in states. But then also, as I talked about a little bit earlier, the enhanced federal support to the states has been something that states have padded state budgets. And so we saw historic levels of budget surpluses. We saw spending growth up tremendously in states over the last year. But then also we've seen states really take advantage of this opportunity to reduce both individual and business taxes. And we've seen now nearly half of the states do that on even the personal income tax side alone in the last 3 state legislative sessions. Just to skip through a couple of the records here on the flat tax, as we've talked about a little bit with Utah and their successes, we actually saw 5 states just in the last legislative session in 2022 move towards more of a flat personal income tax, a single rate personal income tax. Now, one of the key takeaways from rich states, poor states, and I think one of the best ways to measure a state, because there's obviously a lot of noise that goes on in terms of different state GDP numbers, GSP, as they call it at the state level, as well as personal income growth and other ways, unemployment rates, to measure how healthy a state is versus another. But in the work that we've done over the last 16 years now, I think it's almost impossible to escape this dynamic. If you're an uncompetitive state, a state that is not conducive to business growth and investment, it's not conducive to individual taxpayers, it's almost impossible to be a state that's gaining population over the long term. But on the flip side of that, if you're a state with real economic opportunity that values business development, values individual taxpayers, you see very strong results in terms of the net domestic migration. So let's talk a little bit about what that is briefly. That is not the overall population numbers. So what you see on the overall top line population trends includes international immigration, and it also includes death rates and birth rates. But what we look at in rich states, poor states, and what we look at in the next two slides here is how Americans, as we like to say, continue to vote with their feet and move from one state to another. So net domestic migration takes out population, other components such as birth rates and death rates and international immigration, and focuses on Americans when they're here. What are they doing? Where are they moving? And why are they moving across state lines? And we can actually point to the U.S. Census Bureau, who tracks this, and the IRS, who tracks this every year. And the number one reason why people move from state to state, I know a lot of people have different theories about this, and a lot of things play into those decisions. But the number one reason is economic opportunity. People move to make their lives better off and make their kids' lives better off and have more economic opportunity and follow those jobs across state lines. And of course, coming out of the pandemic and having the kind of flexibility that employers needed to give employees to keep the best employees across the country in many cases, we've seen a huge uptick in this net domestic migration across the 50 states. That has been a huge development, I think, that has been understated in Washington, because you look at the numbers here on this slide, for instance, the incredible record of, let's say, Florida, over 318,000 new residents. And this, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, is over the last 12 months. This is the most recent data from the U.S. Census Bureau that covers the last 12 months on record. Florida has gained nearly 1,000 individuals per day over the last 12 months from the other 49 states. Texas not far behind, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, many of the states that rank best, let's say, in our economic outlook ranking, and being most pro-business, being most pro-taxpayer, are states that are gaining in terms of population. And looking at the flip side, you can say, look at that record of California and New York rating 45th and 50th, respectively, in our economic outlook score. California nearly losing an individual, 1,000 individuals per day on net to the other 49 states, with New York, Illinois, New Jersey, and Massachusetts in the bottom five. And if you had to classify the difference of philosophy, of course, in many cases, it's whether these states are pro-business and have a business development mindset and keeping those policies in mind when it comes to tax and regulatory and labor policies, and other states that are becoming more free market and becoming more pro-taxpayer and pro-business are the ones, of course, gaining. Now, let me just, in my last minute or two here, talk about a few of the threats that we have. We look at the state level, there's been the huge run-up in spending. I think that states that value more broad-based taxation, retail sales taxes, let's say, versus discriminatory levies on businesses and other business income taxes, are states that rely less on volatile forms of taxation if they can get away from business type taxes. Secondly, over-reliance on federal funds. This is something, as the average state budget has ballooned with federal funds over the last several years, as we've talked about. What happens in a $34 trillion debt environment at the federal level when the federal government does not have the ability to continue sending that aid to the states? What happens at that point? That's a huge topic of discussion among our ALEC legislators as to what we would do with the programs as they currently exist without federal support, let's say. And then when you look at spending restraint and the need for growth, these are all issues to address at the state level. But I do think something that's just, skip through a few of my final slides here so we can get to the final tax points here and then questions. I think that when it comes to where we're seeing things from a macro perspective, some major inflection points lie ahead, both federally at the state level. What do we do with the $34 trillion debt environment? Not to mention Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and not to mention the gridlock issue of not being able to even get back to budgeting in terms of a normal budget process in Washington, D.C. As I was with former Speaker Newt Gingrich last week at our ALEC conference, he reminded us the only 4 regular balanced budgets that we've had basically in our lifetime happened in the 1990s, and we haven't had that since in Washington. We have a major inflection point federally and nationally is to decide what to do with the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that will phase out by the end of 2025 if nothing is done. done. I think that could potentially have a major softening effect on the economy and may be the thing that would push us into something other than a soft landing. We see state economic competitiveness as a good counterbalance to the gridlock in Washington. We see many states moving ahead with pro-growth, pro-business policies that are looking to really be the pace setters. And this competition between states is an inherently good and healthy thing for our system of government and for us broadly as taxpayers, as an economy. Cannot discount this factor of people and businesses continuing to move across state lines, and I think really show us the framework for successful state economic policy at the federal and state level. And then finally, to get out from under some of the malaise that we have with inflation, with debt, some of the big challenges that we have as a nation and as a federal situation here, we absolutely need states to continue to push the envelope, move the ball forward, and continue to create those jobs and that economic opportunity to keep America moving forward. So I'll just end with that. I just really appreciate the opportunity to bring this briefing for what's happening at the state level, what's happening a little bit at the federal level here in Washington. Really appreciate our partnership with Security Industry Association. Don, you and Colby have been great, and we look forward to working with all of you going forward as we pursue some of our common policy objectives.
Now, Jonathan, first of all, thank you for making time to deliver this presentation. It was a great overview of what I would describe on what's on the mind of state policymakers, right? Particularly those that have budget authority in the states and what lies ahead. And I want to spend a couple of minutes just digging into some of your points, if you don't mind. Then we'll open up to some other questions that Ozzy is moderating. Let me start with just a very broad, big picture question. How well prepared in general are states for an economic downturn in 2024? Are there certain states that stand out to you as being better prepared because of their fiscal policies, because of their rainy day funds, et cetera? And which states are you particularly concerned about?
Well, it's a great question, Don, and something that I remember during the pandemic early on. We compared the states and their relative health of their rainy day funds. A really important topic that you brought up there. It's something that we've actually developed model policy on, to have a healthy state rainy day fund, in addition to some other really key elements of fiscal health. And one thing that I would refer everyone to that would like to look into this further is we've developed really a platform of economic and budget policy reforms for state policymakers to look at, called the ALEC State Budget Reform Toolkit, that includes things like best practices like rainy day funds. And I remember coming out of the pandemic, comparing and contrasting Wyoming, which at the time and usually has one of the healthiest rainy day funds in America, versus the state of Illinois, state that is not, right? And Illinois recently has added, I think, to their rainy day fund, I saw slightly, but we had a scenario where I think Wyoming could pay for an entire year or several years of state spending through their rainy day fund, where I think if we calculated it down to where Illinois was at the start of the pandemic, I think they could fund government operations in the state of Illinois with their rainy day fund for a grand total of 16 minutes. And so, I mean, that was the difference between the two different philosophies on rainy day funds. So I think that's an important factor to look at. Now, the upside of this really, I think, larger concerning topic of federal maybe overextending themselves into the states when it comes to budget support, and that is that states have padded their rainy day funds in many cases with that extra, broad funding. We all know it's fungible. And so while there were certain direct strings attached to the ARPA funds, let's say, or other federal funds that went to the state and local level, being money as fungible as it is, states were able to take other revenue collections and obviously save for a rainy day. And I think that's been something that state budgets are at very healthy levels in many cases. But you look at the overall dynamics of it, and let's say, for an answer where California is already a budget deficit situation, New York in a budget deficit situation, while some states are still seeing huge increases in record revenue levels coming in. A couple of things point to there, and one is, don't take my word for it. Take Gavin Newsom, governor of California, because I think he recently said at the beginning of the year, when California went from what had been advertised at least as something like $100 billion budget surplus into a $30+ billion budget shortfall, Governor Newsom even said, this is somewhat of a determination by our state revenue system. And so, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, states can be overly reliant on volatile sources of revenue. And California is, I think, the example of that. Is California relies more on capital gains tax collections, dividend payouts, as well as progressive income taxes that go up dramatically during good economic times, but have the real potential and the history of really falling out when economic conditions weaken. And so that boom and bust cycle of states that over rely on volatile sources of revenue like business taxes and capital-based taxes is a real downside when you get into a volatile situation with, let's say, a downturn in the economy. So the states I think that are best positioned are the states we saw some of the best growth states we've been talking about, Texas and Florida, two of the big states in that category, don't even have personal income taxes, as you know, Don. And so relying on more sources of revenue that are broad-based and less volatile through the business cycle. So that on the revenue piece of it is a big thing. And then there's some key elements in terms of states that have stopped the urge to, I think, overextend themselves from a spending perspective. For instance, Colorado in their state constitution has something called the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which has been in their constitution for 30 years and has really stopped the inclinations during many years to overspend, I would say, during the good times, and then have a situation like California does, where you went from huge budget surplus to huge budget deficit in the course of a couple of months. Some really important tools like that, and rainy day funds that you talk about, is really an important element of this. And so I think it comes back to math, though. I mean, states, 49 out of the 50 states have a balanced budget amendment in their constitution or in state law. Only Vermont does not. And so it comes down to balancing revenue and spending needs at the same time. And that's the practical type of decision making I think many Americans really wished happened in Washington, D.C. It kind of gets back to one of my favorite economists, Thomas Sowell, at the Stanford Institute, at the Hoover Institute at Stanford, puts it this way: the first law of economics is that we have a scarcity of resources. We don't have everything we want, so we have to economize. The first law of politics, however, especially in Washington, D.C., is to ignore the first law of economics. And so that is, Don, where we get into ourselves into the problem. We know what's coming. We know what some of the best practices and the policies are to avoid this. That's just sometimes the policy and the politics somewhat separate on this.
No, I appreciate that. Jonathan, let me pick up on one of the concepts you just talked about, and that's the concept of over-reliance, right? Which you've alluded to, you've described in a couple of different contexts. The one area I'd like to focus, though, around the concept of over-reliance relates to grant funding, right? So for our audience, so we're the security industry, this industry dedicated to protecting critical infrastructure across the country in all of the districts that your state legislators operate: schools, airports, maritime facilities, et cetera, government buildings. In terms of over-reliance, though, from the perspective of state governments, there's been an unprecedented amount of money expended by the federal government to the states in recent years for a variety of reasons, right? Some of which are related to COVID. From the perspective of states, though, who anticipate and perhaps in some cases view those funds as a source of entitlement, what are the strings attached to those funds that are cumbersome to the states that our industry needs to be aware of, whether they be cost shares or what have you? And then another piece of that question is, to what extent are states being innovative with their own grant programs so they have more autonomy to that point about how to use grant funds? What do you see, just big picture trend around grant policy as it relates to overall fiscal policy?
Yeah, that's an important piece. And I will say it's really at the top of the mind of many state legislators right now, not only for the uncertainty of how long the federal support will be there and what the states will do in that reality in many cases, but then to this idea of the strings attached to the money. This is something that is nothing new, right? It's federal government sends, and for many good reasons sometimes, to keep state level policymakers within the framework that these funds are intended, right? and it's not totally a wide open game where states, let's say, could pad pension funds or debt with that particular federal support, because there's obvious real policy rationale that goes with these funds. And even as things are potentially block granted to states and to give states the most autonomy possible, I think that's a real discussion I think needs to be had in Washington. When you look at, I think the piece that I hear most about from really the strings and the cost of the federal funds coming in, because everyone many times pays attention to this is money coming in that's so-called free money, right? There's no such thing as a free lunch, as Milton Friedman, the great economist, always reminded us. It comes with strings. The biggest one I hear about is the maintenance of effort requirements, that by the virtue of, even if you commingle, let's say, a project with a small amount of federal funds, and let's say the vast majority of a infrastructure project or school construction project is state and local, let's say, even with a de minimis amount of federal support, immediately you have prevailing wage laws, let's say, that get enhanced with Davis-Bacon federal law, and things like that get added to the requirements that in many cases drive up the cost of those infrastructure projects 10, 20, 25%, right? And so there's been a real effort for states to try to have a better understanding of maybe keeping certain projects siloed within state and local support exclusively, so they can avoid some of those federal requirements that come even with a very small amount of federal support. The other thing that I think a state like Utah, number one in rich states, poor states, that I've talked a little bit about already, one of the great things they've developed, and we talk with legislators about this often, is having a more robust state level review process of those federal grants, to say, when we accept these federal funds, what are we setting ourselves up for, and both on the positive and the negative side of that, and have a better understanding of what is attached with the federal support, or in many cases, federal support that goes directly to local units of government and bypasses state level really authority altogether, and really getting a survey of what is out there, because there's so many different federal programs going to so many different state and local units of government. That's really just an area of getting our heads wrapped around, is what all is coming to the state level. And then in the case of Utah, one of the reasons that the bond rating agencies have pointed to Utah, that they've kept a AAA bond rating for many years in a row now, is the idea that they have a plan in place that if and when federal support is reduced to the state of Utah, they have a plan in place to say, what will we do to make up for that difference? And so they've done contingency analysis to say, if the federal support goes down by 5, 10, 15%, what will Utah pick up? What will we allow private sector partners or civic organizations to pick up? And then what programs will we allow to sunset with the end of federal support? I think that's a really important thing for state policymakers to look at, to keep fiscal conditions in line, especially with potential national weakness ahead with the economy.
No, makes sense. Thank you. And then just last question for me before we open it up. In terms of rates of growth, both on the revenue side and on the expenditure side, the spending side, top level, can you just review that with us a little bit? What's projected for 2024 coming out of, say, the top 10 states?
Yeah, I think when you're looking at growth numbers, when you look at spending side, obviously when state economies are successful, it gives them more flexibility in terms of being able to have a more robust spending. And so when you have these new taxpayers coming into your state, when you're an inbound migration state like Florida or Texas or North Carolina, I can remember the example in recent years where North Carolina has been an aggressive tax cutting state in recent years, but they were also then able to finance teacher pay raises because they actually had an extra 100,000 taxpayers coming into their state. That's been something that's a virtuous cycle of having a strong economic outlook, having strong economic performance, and then being able to invest that when it comes to prioritized levels of spending. And so I think when you look at, obviously history is no guarantee of future results, but you look at the history of the states that have, been at the top of our economic outlook rankings like Utah and others, and there is a real growth premium associated with being a competitive state, whether that's a few percentage points in some cases, or you look at some of the most aggressive states to be pro-economic development, and you see a real economic premium being associated with having that type of policy environment. I do think, though, there's going to be a softening in state level revenue continuing. The kind of growth in the last year of 40% spending growth overall in the last couple of years at the state level is not going to continue at that trend. We're already starting to see signs on the monthly and the quarterly reporting in states, not just California and New York either, but states all across the country, of more of a normalizing of revenue, especially as some of the federal tranches of support go down. We're going to see less of that sales tax revenue as individuals spend that as it goes through the economy. And so I do think we're still going to see positive economic outlooks in a large majority of states. We're going to still see states looking at, say, cutting taxes and becoming more competitive this session again in 2024 versus states raising taxes. But I do think we're going to see a little bit more of a scenario where we see states at both ends of the spectrum versus the last several years where, Don, as you know, there haven't been many states raising taxes because of all this extra money sitting around state capitals.
Right. No, exactly. So, Ozzy, would you mind sharing one or two questions that may have come in?
Yes, we have several questions that actually came in throughout your presentation, Jonathan. First one, does your mentioned equation for places to live take into consideration public programs like schools and higher education, or is it strictly from a business perspective?
Yeah, and that's a great question. Yeah, what we look at in rich states, poor states is strictly from a business competitiveness perspective and a competitiveness perspective from an economic side. And so we fully acknowledge there's lots of other reasons why some states are more competitive than others. But what we focus on is what are the policy levers that state legislators have, governors have to enhance more business investment and more economic competitiveness. And as a result, there's lots of other great ways to measure states, and we encourage people to check those out as well. We don't aim to be the end all be all in ways to rank states. But when you look at, I think, the track record of states that follow a positive pro-business outlook on economic development, I think the economic results speak for themselves in terms of that growth premium being a top-rated state in rich states, poor states from being a bottom-rated state.
Thank you. Second question. SIA is currently conducting a wage study for our industry, but a lot of our members want to know what is happening with wage growth across the country. Is it slowing? Is it coming back to normal growth levels?
Yeah, I think you're going to have a normalization generally in wages as well. Obviously, with the a huge issue of worker shortage, labor shortage that we had coming out of the pandemic, to some extent, still parts of the country, extremely low unemployment rates where people are just having a very difficult time finding workers at all skill levels. But even just anecdotally talking with state legislators at the base level retail jobs and minimum wage jobs. Otherwise, in a normal economy, we're talking, $18, $20 starting, wages per hour at even fast food restaurants in many parts of the country. And so there is going to be certainly that pressure to find employees at especially certain levels of experience and skill levels. But I do think from a macro perspective, we're seeing that really probably was unsustainable growth in the last couple of years come back to slightly more normal levels, similarly to housing. I mean, we're seeing some of these trends that we saw during the pandemic, where we saw housing go off the charts in terms of housing prices and values across the country. We're seeing a normalization of that because of interest rate environment and many other things I talked about. And so I think some of the more extreme parts of the economy and reaction to the pandemic and government response to the pandemic are now coming a little bit back closer to the normal range that we had seen pre-2020.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next question. The security industry has had a workforce shortage challenge, but outside of our industry, are layoff conditions normalizing and easing talent shortages?
To some degree, right? I mean, we're seeing it in to some levels. It's getting better than it had been, I think, in the last couple of years. That progress is slow. And I think to some degree, we need to examine some of the underlying reasons why people are not looking for work. That's something that we've looked at even pre-pandemic in our research, that with some of the, I think in many cases, well-meaning government programs out there, they have this issue of really this cliff. We call it the benefits cliff. Many of you have heard about this, of what it would take to basically break even as an individual. And we did a scenario where we had, I think it was Pennsylvania, we used as our test case, and a single mother with two children under Pennsylvania benefits as well as federal benefits. I think the break even point with that individual hypothetically would have to earn, take a starting wage of $70,000 a year to make it worthwhile from a dollars and cents perspective to get back into the workforce. That's obviously a little bit more of an extreme example, but I mean, it underscores the point of there is a real disincentive, especially in some states, for individuals to get back into the workforce. And so that was exacerbated during the pandemic. And some of those, like I said, well-intentioned programs in many cases to try to aid individuals as they needed it. But I do think that there is that overarching policy debate that probably needs to happen around what are the kind of disincentives that are keeping people from the workforce, and why is it that individuals are not looking for work in many cases? And I think to answer that question is going to help answer the question of how can we get back to the bottom of this worker shortage issue.
Another question around the rising federal debt. Can you talk a little further about how the rising debt situation could impact our economy and the technology businesses that we represent?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is the largest challenge, I mean, we all face when it comes to a policy environment and probably an economic environment overall. I mean, in one way, we've already been paying for it in the terms of inflation, right? As we've seen just historic inflation levels now becoming back down to, not quite the Federal Reserve 2% historic target, but just over 3%, at least on the core number. Now, that obviously doesn't take in consideration many of the lead expenses for an average family across the United States, may not be an accurate representative exactly where we're at. But I mean, the reason why we're having the kind of inflation that we're having is too many dollars chasing too few goods. We've seen the Federal Reserve as well as appropriators and the spending folks in Washington, in the White House, and in Congress. And once again, this is an indictment on one party versus another because it's a bipartisan problem that's developed over a number of decades now. But it's one that is becoming, I think, quickly unraveling when it comes to how quickly this is, with the matching with the interest rate environment, and now $1 trillion plus a year in interest costs, you're getting us nothing other than paying the costs of federal borrowing decisions, right? And so much of the federal debt had been short-term in nature that the debt as it rolls over, and we're issuing new bonds, let's say a 10-year bond over 4% interest with shorter-term debt even higher than that right now at the current market rates. You're financing 34 trillion of that. It becomes a huge issue of crowding out other areas of spending that are key areas when it comes to infrastructure and other pieces that we really need to be spending money on as a federal government, right? Those core functions. The other thing that it does is it raises the specter of either allowing the 2017 tax cuts to expire and all of the economic consequences that may have on individuals directly. Certainly that would be the case. But would that push us into some sort of an economic correction? It wouldn't be the first time a tax increase or even a threat of a tax increase at the federal level did that to the federal economy. And, if we don't get this issue of interest cost on debt and the overall spending trajectory addressed, there will need to be a discussion at Washington whether we will vastly reduce other areas of spending to finance this enhanced debt and the debt payments and the cost of that, or are we going to raise taxes in the country? And that's a discussion that I know is going to be sorted out over the next several years now, but it has huge ramifications over potential for economic growth and every industry across the country, and in addition to every taxpayer across the country.
So, Jonathan, one of the things I would jump in and say is that, as you might imagine, part of our mission is to provide our members with pieces of information and with access to experts that could share different nuggets and insights that will influence their business planning for the coming year. And I have to tell you, I think through this briefing, there's no question there's exceptional value found through Alec's economic analysis and you specifically, and the programs you present. And I think today you certainly delivered, and we really appreciate that in terms of the information you shared and forecasts and insight to state decision making. And I just want to thank you for that. And I would say to our audience, including those that were joining us through live streaming, that stay tuned for a message from Colby Williams in the next couple of days that will talk further about our involvement within ALEC, as well as the resolutions that I mentioned at the beginning of this program. But with that, Jonathan, thank you very much. And Ozzy, thank you for managing the Q&A.
Well, thanks, Don. It's been a pleasure to be with you all. We really appreciate your partnership and know that you all have friends at ALEC looking to work with you to support the best practices and good policy across the states and in Washington, D.C.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan.